background team here. There we go. All right. So hello, my name is Nicole Olivier, Programs Manager for the Canadian Mountain Network. Welcome to today's webinar on Imagining Indigenous Resurgence and Restoration, Rereading Colonial Photography Archives. Joining us today is Stoney Nakoda, Acting Director of Consultation, William Snow, Director of the Mountain Legacy Project, Dr. Eric Higgs, and Cultural Anthropologist, Dr. Sarah Jacobs. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the land that we are all joining from today. Members of our panel and the host team are situated across Canada, and I'd like to acknowledge that we are all on the ancestral lands and territories of numerous and diverse Indigenous nations, and we pay tribute to their heritage and legacy as we strengthen ties with the communities we serve while taking concrete actions towards meaningful reconciliation. We recognize the historical trauma and the triumphs that many different cultures, lands, and nations have continuously faced within Canada. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work with Indigenous communities in advancing their vision and aspirations on this land. We pay respect to all Indigenous people from all nations across Canada. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers and honor their leaders. But now I'd like to invite Bill Snow to start our time off together in a good way.
Humble stage, good day. My name is William Snow, and I'm a member of the Good Stoney First Nation west of Calgary, and I'm here in Winchispa Yade, also known as Calgary, in Calgary, Alberta, in the Treaty 7 area. In the spirit of truth and reconciliation, I wish to welcome everyone to this Canadian Mountain Network webinar. And I also wish to acknowledge all of our brothers and sisters and Two-Spirit people in the LGBTQ community. And that I hope that this will be an open, safe, and respectful learning space for everyone. Ishnish, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Sorry. So I just want to give you a little bit of housekeeping before we get started here. As the presentation unfolds, please put your questions and comments in the Q&A section down below at the bottom of the screen. And when we get to the end, we will promote those questions and comments to the panelists. So this webinar will delve into the historical images of mountain places throughout Indigenous culture and how they are being revitalized through the work of Indigenous knowledge holders. We will explore the process of naming mountain peaks with their traditional Indigenous names and how this restoration of Indigenous knowledge is contributing to the resurgence of Indigenous cultures. And our speakers here today will explore the power of imagery and help us gain a deeper understanding of the importance of recognizing and honoring Indigenous cultures in the context of mountain landscapes. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric and the team to take it from here.
Great, thank you so much, Nicole. And it's a privilege and pleasure to be part of this series and to be part of the Canadian Mountain Network and to join with Bill. Now, Sarah and I are located today on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, the Songhees and the Esquimalt First Nations in what is now known as Victoria. And so we're coming from a coastal area, although Sarah is actually based in Calgary. She just happens to be here today. So, and Bill, as mentioned, is in the staring at the Rockies. So we want to cover quite a bit today. So we're going to start off with a big discussion about changing landscapes and the idea of ecological restoration. It animates a lot of the work that I've been doing in my research and my teaching, and what my research team does. We're thinking a lot about how things are changing and how we respond to that. So we want to set that up a little bit. And then we want to look at this, how it is that Indigenous resurgence and restoration can be accommodated with some of the photographic evidence that we have. So this is the work of the Mountain Legacy Project and what how are the images powerful in, or specifically, how is this preeminent colonial photographic archive, as we'll hear more about later today, can it be repurposed in the service of indigenization and indigenous resurgence? But we want, after that, to go back and just look a little bit more deeply at the Mountain Legacy Project, because this will be new for some, and we'd like to explain what it's about. And then what are some of the select applications that we have drawing from that work, not just the work that we're doing in partnership with the Stoney Nakoda Nation, but other potential initiatives that help us work with these images, and perhaps as a way of kind of inspiring your thinking about ways in which these internationally distinctive images can be used. So that's the background. So I'm going to start with the changing landscapes and restoration part. So surveyors went out across the mountains of Western Canada and took photographs. This is a photo composite from Old Fort Point in what is now Jasper National Park in 1915. And you can notice, I think, that the landscape is pretty open and patchy in the forested environments. You can see, if you look carefully, in the center of the image, the embryonic town of what was then known as Fitzhugh, now Jasper. Teams, especially my colleague Janine Remtula, who's now a professor at UBC, and I went back in 1998 and we repeated these images, and you can see extensive forest infill. Now, I'm just telling a very simple story here, but we went back again in 2019 and the story is different yet again. And here we have the formation of patchiness again, and you can see the red or the reddish brown in this image are trees that have been killed by a mountain pine beetle. I want to start here because this is just emblematic of a particular driver of change that's coming at us in ways that we haven't really had to contend with previously in understanding how landscapes, so ecosystems and landscapes shift. So the mountain pine beetle, very, very quickly, many on this webinar will know about it, perhaps too much about it, but it's it's a wood-boring beetle associated with a wide variety of pine trees. It's a native species, which is interesting, but starting in the early 1990s, it began to expand its range. So warmer winter conditions in particular allowed the species to flourish and reach epidemic proportions that overwhelmed the evolved defenses of individual trees. And so we started to see this spread. So if we look at 1999, the image, and I don't know how long this is going to take to refresh on your Zoom screens, but I'll go slowly. We're going through year by year, and we look at the shifting populations of the beetles. It's 2004 and 5. Then you can see it crossing the mountains there, and then this huge run by 2007. So this is new. This spread of population is something that's really distinctive and has consequences for how we think about the landscape. So if we come back to the mountain pine beetle, it's just one example of a particular type of driver of change that we're seeing and trying to understand. This is fascinating to me because it speaks a lot to what counts as responsible intervention in landscapes undergoing rapid change. It's not just mountain pine beetles, though. There's a lot of other types of change. We can look at big picture, sort of global drivers of change. This is from Persson's work out of the Sweden at the Resilience Institute, looking at all sorts of different drivers of change. So climate change and biodiversity changes, land system changes, freshwater, biogeochemical flows, ocean acidification, atmospheric aerosols, stratospheric ozone depletion, and novel entities, which is a fascinating topic in itself. But this is a redo of some earlier work, started out in 2015, but it really starts to get at this larger idea of change. Now, Those aren't the only changes, though. A lot of, biogeochemists and ecologists will talk about these structural changes, but we also have to account for the fact that there are cultural, religious, social, economic, and political changes also underway that shape our relationship to nature or the other than human world. Now, collaborators in the research group that I work in have been looking at a whole bunch of different phenomena. I'll just pick out one because this is fascinating. Looking at changes in tree line ecotone. This is a publication led by Andrew Trant, who's now at the University of Waterloo and associated with the Canadian Mountain Network, and Brian Strzomski as well. But looking at photographic evidence to track how change has taken place in tree line over time, and we see a very distinctive, clear signal on the upward movement of tree line up and down the spine of the Rockies. So that's just another indication. But if we turn to a subject close to my heart, which is ecological restoration, what does all this dynamism and change tell us about how we need to do restoration? So back in what I refer to as maybe not the good old days, but even just 20 years ago, people doing restoration were very focused on historical references and sort of using history as a kind of template to set targets for what we should be doing to recover degraded or damaged ecosystems. But a group of us realized that actually we probably needed a new version of restoration, a restoration 2.0, that would have a more flexible approach. So history would be a guide, not a template. I go into that in more detail, but I think we're now realizing, I don't know whether we need a restoration 2.5 or 3, I don't know. But, there's other things that are coming into play as we look at what's shaping how we do restoration. So there's aesthetic considerations, at-risk species, historical references and how they count, ecological novelty, so new assembling subspecies, new combinations of species, climate, of course, shifting cultural values. We weren't really talking about ecosystem services 20 years ago, and we are now, and so that's an example of a really major shift in value. Poverty alleviation is a very critical global concern. It's a concern in Canada as well, of course. Sustainable livelihoods, so how do communities depend on nature-based sources for livelihood. And then Indigenous resurgence, which is a theme, certainly a very critical theme for what we're talking about today, and it is globally as well. But all of these things are creating complications for how we think about this idea of ecological restoration. Leads me to a couple of questions. How will future restoration contribute to ecological integrity? So that's the kind of ecological question. But how can restoration advance Indigenous resurgence too? So how in the work that we do can we support Indigenous resurgence? So that's a bit of a quick background to this idea of landscape change and restoration. Let's turn to the second part, which is about Indigenous resurgence and restoration. And I'm going to begin, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bill and to Sarah. This slide from the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation really grabbed me. When Bill and I were doing some work on a presentation, actually at the International Mountain Conference last year, we used this quote. So this is from the Honorable Murray Sinclair: "Education is what got us into this mess, and education will get us out." So what is the role of knowledge and the different forms of knowledge that contribute to addressing some of the very significant changes? And then, it kind of hits a really specific point for us in our research, because we say, how can the Mountain Legacy Project support Indigenous reconciliation and resurgence? So one of the things we looked at, for example, if we go to work by Graham McDowell and his colleague, They focused on mapping mountains in Canada to get a sense of, really for the first time, comprehensive assessment spatially. And one of the figures out of their paper looks at Indigenous territories and linguistic territories. And if you're wondering what K1 means, it's a mountain classification system. But what we did was overlay the images that we know about on these maps. So we know that there were tens of thousands of historic survey images. And what does that look like when we lay over? So let me do that transition. And you'll see on the left-hand side of the screen, a remarkable overlap of the images with Indigenous territories. And so that's a really important clue for us of the significance of these historic early colonial, or in some cases pre-colonial, evidence of what the landscape looks like. Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, Eric. So I just wanted to talk briefly about the work that we've been doing with the Mount Legacy project. So for this particular picture, this is a molding, I guess, together of two of the early photographs of the 10 peaks out in southwestern Alberta, out in the Moraine Lake area. And for the Stoney people, this is a very important and a culturally significant place. And these particular place names for these peaks, for the existing names for the 10 peaks, we have something like three existing Stoney names of the original 10. And through the work of a project here and being able to recreate this panorama of images from the early mountaineer Arthur O. Wheeler, we were able to then see, put all these images into one panoramic picture, and then able to add in the Stoney place names for these particular peaks. And that was very important for Stoney people, and this is capturing that. So we worked with our people in the Stoney Education Authority out at the reserve at Morley, and we got the proper spelling, which is basically 1 to 10 in Stoney. Waji nom yamni tosa sapta sakbe sagwi saknora napchuink and winkchima. And so these were the again the three surviving names that are in the original that exist today. Those are names that are not exactly spelled properly in Stoney, and so we undertook that process to properly spell them out and to then label them onto this image with the help of the Mountain Legacy project. So it's important, I think, to have these names for these places because names are important because they speak to the cultural significance, the cultural importance of landscapes, which I think is missing in many of our assessments and studies and our current understanding of many mountain landscapes, mountain landscapes and otherwise. So it was very important for the community to recognize that these should be reflecting those early Stoney names of those particular peaks.
You want me to go to the next slide?
Sure. And we were also able to work with groups on other topics relating to the use of fire in landscapes, as Eric pointed out, that there's a great diversity of images that shows how landscapes existed 100 years ago and how they exist today. Eric, I think you wanted, I'm not sure if Sarah was going to speak also about this.
Yeah, well, I can turn to the next slide, or unless you want to say any more about the
We have been doing some works on Indigenous fire stewardship with Banff National Park, and we're hoping to incorporate more images into the works that Parks Canada is looking to do in terms of their fire stewardship. There is a lot of understanding yet to happen in and around how fire was used, times of year and place. And so we have been able to slowly raise those issues with Parks Canada. And I would also say that that message is also spreading a little bit more widely. For example, we as Stoney, we were able to take part in an initial fire burn down in through the Kananaskis area just recently. So we are being able to incorporate some traditional knowledge process into some of the current fire smart programs currently going on in the area.
Great.
All right, thank you, Bill. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So it's kind of a nice point for me to come in and start discussing a knowledge partnership that we've been working on for the last many months and are just really starting to undertake some real concrete work towards seeing through. And so this builds on the sorts of projects that Bill just spoke to about fire stewardship and place naming, ways in which the MLP image collection can support efforts directed at Indigenous resurgence. And so this knowledge partnership that we're working on with, Bill has been involved in this from the start, as well as some other colleagues at Stoney Nation, and it's funded through CMN and support for me through my tax. But the goal with this project is not only to benefit Stoney Nakoda nations through use of MLP imagery, but to work to develop a model that could lead to wider nationwide networks of collaborations with Indigenous communities, kind of speaking back to that map that Eric showed of the incredible overlap of Indigenous communities with the historical imagery. So I'm just going to provide a bit of an overview of what this knowledge partnership looks like and the processes and steps that we're going through as we put the images in the service of resurgence. So I'm going to speak a bit to each of these points today. And as I work through this, the very end, as I get to thinking through when our research is completed and we're working through knowledge mobilization, that part of this process is, as I just mentioned, hopefully leading to wider networks of collaboration, but also we hope future work that within the Stoney Nakoda Nations, building on a land camp that we are planning to host this summer. So I'm just going to begin in what would be kind of the planning and building the team phase, this very start of our work. And for us, that begins with thinking through an ethical framework for the project. And this is the real foundation of our partnership. And it guides how, of course, all the details are going to shape up, and really influences how we will think through the success of the project and reflect on what we've learned through our research. So as we work to develop an ethical framework, we really benefited from very thoughtful scholarship from a number of Indigenous scholars who have gifted us with some teachings about ways to work respectfully with Indigenous knowledge. We have the 5 R's, and the 5 R's are relationships, respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. So it's a wonderfully kind of succinct, just 5 R's to remember, but extremely profound and important ethical concepts to be reminded of as we work through this process. And then more specifically, so we're thinking about ways to work with traditional Indigenous knowledge systems and Western science. There are a number of well-known approaches that we could draw on. So I'm sure many people in the audience today are familiar with both of these concepts, two-eyed seeing and braiding knowledge. Two-eyed seeing was proposed by Elder Albert Marshall, Mi'kmaq elder. And the idea with two-eyed seeing is that you draw on each perspective, on traditional Indigenous knowledge and Western science. By drawing on each perspective, you can deepen collective understandings and address problems. And then in a somewhat similar metaphor, Potawatomi biologist Robin Kimmerer has proposed that you braid Western knowledge with Indigenous knowledge. And either one of those approaches, could theoretically work for a project like ours. However, we have a Stoney concept that we can work with. And so the Stoney concept that we are employing is biculturalism. And biculturalism was written about by the late Chief John Snow in his History of the Stoney People. And he describes it as drawing on the best of traditional Stoney knowledge and Western knowledge and using that sort of wealth of knowledge to solve problems, to address contemporary challenges. And so that's the approach that Bill and his colleagues used in the bison reintroduction study. It was funded through CMN, and the approach that we've settled on in this project, because excuse me, it's a really lovely idea to be taking the best of both worlds. And then lastly, as we work through developing the project, we want to work in a good way. And in a good way references the advice that has been provided by numerous elders to researchers. And in that council, elders are emphasizing that research should benefit the communities that are involved and integrate local ethics. So I think you can see that clearly in this project, we're working hard to keep going in a good way. So that's an awful lot of talk about ethics, but it matters to getting this right. Yes,
Sorry, Sarah. I just wanted to add in just a few more points. So one of the things that we talk about in the bison study is this concept or idea around ethical space or cultural space, and that was gifted to all of us by the elder Ernest Willey, Cree elder from the Treaty 4 area, when he talks about ethical space. And that's really important because we want to, in order to have communication and bridging of knowledges between two different systems, we first need to have space in which we can converse, talk, and practice out those worldviews or knowledge systems. The only other thing I would add is that we, in terms of utilizing these knowledge systems, these traditional knowledge systems, is that there is a role and a responsibility that needs to be taken when we're incorporating or attempting to incorporate these knowledge systems into Western systems or Western projects. And so it's done with and I think that speaks to the way in which people are asked to proceed in a good way, and being respectful and mindful that these are knowledge systems that are to be used with reverence and respect. That's all I wanted to add. Thanks, Sarah.
Well, thank you, Bill. You spoke more eloquently about it than I did, so I appreciate the interjection very much. Thank you. So drawing on this ethical framework, you may kind of be asking, well, what are some of the next concrete steps? So we've done this work, and as Bill just added, working to create ethical space in which this knowledge can be shared. What are some of the concrete next research steps? So for us, one of those is the creation of an advisory council. And this is a council of elders and knowledge keepers and other interested community members who can continue to provide advice and guidance as the project proceeds to, again, help the work carry forward in a good way. And then as we move into the next little stages of the project, I want to be thinking about selecting methods that again, tie in directly to this ethical framework. So I'm calling this grounding our methods, because we have these images of the land that are quite powerful. This is a historical image taken from Skogan Peak in Kananaskis area. And this is the repeat image. Yeah, slowly fading in. There we go. From the same vantage point. And so naturally, being on the land is going to be important to our knowledge partnership. And we have two main methods that we're utilizing that are both tied to specific places, but come at place and landscape from different orientations. So we have repeat photography. And this is the work that has been conducted by MLP for almost 2.5 decades now. And we also plan to hold a land camp. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about the land camp, but first I'm just going to speak a bit to the repeat photography and not go into it in too much depth, because I know Eric is going to cover this a little bit more. So the repeat photography work that we're planning is going to be very similar to previous seasons of MLP work in terms of going to locations and recapturing the historical image. However, we will have teams that are built of MLP members and Stoney Nakoda Nation members working together to do that repeat work. And repeat photography, as I said, it matters, of course, that you're in the correct location, that you're in the same place, otherwise you're not going to get a good repeat. But being in the place is more about the land is more about being on the land, not learning from the land. Not in some ways until, I would say, with the repeat photography, until after, when you're comparing before and after photographs. And in contrast, the land camp draws on a very different history. So not the history of scientific photography, but on traditional Indigenous educational models in which elders and youth being on the land together engaged in knowledge sharing. And so that's the activity that our other research method, the main method this summer as we gather for a land camp, will be focused on. And so within this model, we are thinking about how the land is implicated in relationships and responsibilities, and how geography, stories, and knowledge are intertwined. And one of the things that, of course, happened through colonial practices is that access to particular places was prohibited or made difficult. And so that some of the, continuity of being able to connect with places and learn from places and share stories of places was disrupted. And so for us, being able to return to locations and again, re-engage in sharing knowledge becomes a decolonial research method. So what specifically will the land camp look like? Well, as I've mentioned, it's about sharing knowledge from elders and other knowledge keepers, particularly with youth in the community. So it's really important time and space for that activity to be able to take place. And it's also a time when we want to be able to think about how knowledge about conservation and land stewardship, and specifically relating to these places, can be shared. Now, during the land camp that we will be holding this summer, in addition to being able to engage in these sorts of knowledge sharing activities, we also are going to encourage people to take photographs of their choosing, which is a method called photo voice, so that in addition to the MLP repeat photographs, we'll have these participant generated photographs as a result of our project.
If I could just add in,
Yes, please.
Sarah, the out at Stoney, we take part in a bison harvest from the bison herd out at our reserve. And over the last number of years, we've been including students from the elementary school at Morley, students from the Eden Valley community, and also from students from the Bighorn Stoney community. So when these students come out and gather, they come out to the where our bison paddock is, basically the area of my picture behind me, where we've had bison at our Stoney Indian Park since 1970. We've always harvested bison from this herd for the last 50 years, and we've been more recently, as I said, we've been incorporating, bringing in students, as well as bringing in elders and pipe holders to take part, to do ceremony before harvests like that begin. There are a number of camps that go on throughout the Bow Valley and along the eastern slopes throughout the summer. And so one of these land camps that we're planning for, there'll be cultural activities, there'll be elders involved, youth, knowledge keepers. So we're really looking forward to bringing everyone together and understanding the changes in landscape that have been happening through this Mountain Legacy project. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. And touched on something that I hadn't mentioned, which is that Stoney Nakoda Nation does have a lot of capacity and experience in running land camps, which of course we're leaning on in moving forward with this. This next slide has this kind of incredible image that's from the 1940s, taken during Banff Indian Days. And I think it was Bill's idea, I'm not sure, I heard it first from Bill, that the land camp should be held over Indian Days, which is such an awesome idea. So I'll just provide, a very, very brief history here of Banff Indian Days, because as I mentioned, restricted access to places is part of a colonial process that disrupted cultural continuity and the continued sharing of knowledge across generations. So Banff Indian Days was an annual festival that Indigenous peoples who were not allowed access to the park throughout the rest of the year were able to come into the park, but it was kind of a tourist display. So the first iterations of Banff Indian Days that ran from the early 1900s until the late 1970s have this very complex history where people were able to return to some very special and sacred landscapes and perform some ceremony and enjoy being on those landscapes, but at the same time, it was also largely as a show for outside visitors to the park. And then, Bill, please correct me if I have this wrong. In the early 2000s, some Stoney community members got the idea of bringing back Banff Indian Days and reimagining what that festival could be like. And so now, as it runs, it's Nakoda Banff Indian Days, and it is closed to the public and is instead something that's decided between Stoney Nakoda nations and the national parks. So our land camp is going to tie into this existing Indian Days camp period. We're going to carve out a few days of it to, as Bill said, think through the photographs and the changes that have happened on the landscape.
Yeah,
So-
just to, sorry, Sarah, just to add on to that. Yes, first Indian Days, I believe, was back in 1889, coincided with more recently built Banff Springs Hotel with the introduction of the railway. And the early entrepreneurs in the area, Norman Luxton, Tom Wilson, Jim Brewster, Jimmy Simpson, collaborated together. They had already been working with Stoney people in the Banff National Park and wanted to bring Indigenous cultural displays and activities to the visitors that were coming from all across the world, from across the world to Banff Springs Hotel, and many cases still are. So we had the creation of Indian Days since that time, and yes, it did peter out in the mid to late 70s. Was reopened by our elder with the Chiniki First Nation, and was restarted in cooperation with Parks Canada. The elder was Roland Mudd from the Chiniki First Nation that spearheaded the resurgence of the Banff Indian Days. Whereas in the last 100 years, it has been mostly a tourism event. The current event is based more about culture and language is where our basis is. So there is one day where we do open it up to the public, and that's on the Saturday. And that's when we usually try and have a small mini powwow at the grounds on that given Saturday, which is usually the first weekend the first week in August is when we usually have our Indian Days camp. Thanks.
Thank you, Bill. So I'm aware of the time and worrying that we're going to be running quite long. So I'm going to just very quickly mention that, when our summer field activities are completed, the land camp repeat photography, we also plan on conducting interviews with community members, interviews that are based around viewing the photographs some more. So using a method called photo elicitation. And then we're going to have all of this information that has been shared and gathered, and we're going to host collaborative workshops within the community to kind of determine what the major themes are coming out of all of this and what our main findings and recommendations for moving forward are going to be. So through a series of workshops, we'll work through all the material and the things we've learned over the summer. And then we have, the classic kind of knowledge mobilization step, which of course, as everyone says, we want it to be widespread, but we really do. So we're thinking about three main audiences that it's really important for us this work connects with. So it needs to connect within Stoney Nakoda community, and especially reaching youth within that community. And so we're thinking through strategies to conduct presentations within the community, perhaps at schools and so on, to get youth excited about the possibilities in this sort of work and what it can mean for understanding traditional and contemporary lands. And then, of course, we also want to go through traditional or conventional academic venues, so journal articles, conferences, webinars such as this, and planning co-authored papers and presentations with MLP and Stoney Nakoda Nation partners. And then lastly, we're thinking about a much broader audience and ways that we can make the image collection and our findings just really widely available. And one of the things that I'm really excited about the possibilities of is using some digital storytelling techniques and developing a site that allows people to explore text and photography, video, and possibly even some recorded interviews to really understand the story from multiple perspectives and get excited about, again, the possibilities, different ways that these resources can be harnessed. So that's it for me, and I would pass it back to Eric with very little time left. I'm very sorry.
It's okay, I talk fast. No, that's fine. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Bill. That was great. And I wanted, as I said at the beginning of the webinar, what I wanted to do was return to the Mountain Legacy Project and give just a little bit more information for those who are new to it and talk a bit about some applications of it, because that may stimulate some imaginative possibility around work that we might do, or we'd encourage others to partake in. So let me jump in. So we have this remarkable collection of images. This is the Athabasca Glacier, probably the most iconic in the country. And from 1917 to the present, we see dramatic change in landscapes like this, which speaks volumes to us about the nature of change. But we have a lot of images, and they were taken as part of this preeminent colonial survey. This was dozens of surveyors, highly trained, fanned out across the Mountain West in the late 19th and early 20th century to create the first highly detailed topographic maps of the mountains for settlement, for resource extraction, and in some cases for deliberate displacement of Indigenous peoples. So it's a difficult collection to work with. This is both beautiful, powerful, comprehensive, and disturbing at the same time. And we're the only country in the world who undertook map making with images like this in a comprehensive way. There are a few small collections in other parts of the world, but this is the only big one that exists. And the images are spectacular. So I'm choosing one from the very first full year of surveying. In the red box is the early town of Banff from 1888. This is photographed by J.J. MacArthur. He had tested the techniques in the previous year, and he came back. Remember, Banff is 3 years old at this point. Let's zoom in to what the red box shows to get a sense of just the resolution of these images. And for photo enthusiasts out there, these photographs are mostly laid down on glass, not on film, which is why they're so durable. And they're large formats, so they're roughly 4 by 6 inches in size. So that's what allows this spectacular detail to emerge. So starting in, I guess, 1996, it's a bit painful to look back that far, we started doing some repeat work. And so we sent field crews back to different locations. This is in K country, to do systematic repeat photography using state-of-the-shelf camera and survey gear. We got into some remarkable locations doing crazy field work. We visited over 1,000 sites, taken about 10,000 repeat photographs. But this is kind of the glossy front of the project, because in behind is this huge amount of archival research. So partnering now, the longest partnership in the history of Library and Archives Canada with an external institution has been with the Mountain Legacy Project, doing detailed collections assessment, trying to understand how to work with these glass plate negatives, how to digitize them, and how to serve them up in a meaningful way. So it's been just a ton of work behind the scenes to daylight these images literally and figuratively, and then use them in the service of repeat photography and studying change. So when we put all this together, we can say that there's kind of international distinctiveness to this image collection. They're comprehensive because they cover most of the mountain regions in Canada. If we don't have the images up on our website right now, it's because we haven't gotten to them yet, but they're pretty much everywhere. There's over 120,000 of them that we know about, so they're systematic. They're high resolution, as you saw from that Banff image earlier. And there's unprecedented time depth, which makes this very cool. I mean, we have some early aerial images from the 1920s, but mostly the series started in the late 40s in Western Canada. And so we can actually look at the landscape behind or back further in time. So it constitutes the largest collection of systematic, comprehensive, high-resolution mountain photographs in the world. And they're all available for open use. So we serve this up on the Mountain Legacy Explorer site, so explorer.mountainlegacy.ca. There's a map-based and list-based interfaces. You can go deep, and I've heard that people will start casually looking at it in the evening and stay up to the wee hours of the morning, digging into all the nooks and crannies. And speaking of nooks and crannies, you can go quite deep into collections. So this is from Station 54, Kananaskis Ridge, by historic surveyor David Nichols from 1916. And you can see that there's both a historical and a repeat image and where it's located. So, and this, Bill will know this well, but these are images that are located in and around the Stoney Nakoda nation's traditional territories, well, part of the traditional territories. So anyway, have at it, please. These are open access images. We have a Creative Commons license. You're welcome to use them. If you want to use them in a concerted way, talk to us first, because we may have advice on how best to use them. Just to give a little bit of a shout out, because this is a project partly funded by the Canadian Mountain Network. We did a podcast with Future Ecologies, a marvelous podcast series out of Vancouver called Mountain Legacies, and it features Bill and others associated with the project. And so they did a lovely job, I think. And it's also, I'm quite proud to say, it's had the largest number of downloads, episode downloads that Future Ecologies has had so far. So quite happy about that. So let me just, as I wrap up, just look at a few applications, because I want to spark other potential interest in what we're doing. So I'm going to work through very quickly through some of the projects that especially graduate students who are working in our group have been partaking in. So this is Alina Fisher, PhD candidate, and she's her project is Where the Wild Things Are, and she's using camera trap wildlife data and the Mountain Legacy historical repeat images to look at landscape change population change across a guild of mammals. So trying to get a sense of how species have shifted over time across some pretty big areas. And Alina's also very keen on science communications and has a master's degree in that topic. So she's applying those insights into her work. Another PhD candidate, Sonia Wojciechowski, is working in the Crow's Nest Pass area and trying to investigate possible research or restoration futures for landscapes that have been impacted by mining. So this is not a simple matter of, saying, look at the degraded landscapes that mines have left behind, but actually digging into the cultural values underneath that and the traditional ways in which the land was used. So trying to accommodate change and looking to the future for these heavily transformed landscapes. I want to spend a bit of time, just a few slides, on Claire Wright's work. Claire is working in both Waterton and Jasper National Parks. She's a spatial scientist, PhD candidate, PhD student. She's writing her candidacy exams right now as I speak. But Claire is, as a spatial scientist, has been honing new techniques for being able to geo-reference the images. So just a few things. We have extensive coverage in Waterton Lakes National Park. Each of those white dots is where a camera station is, and each station has multiple images. So we're able to recreate a map of the past. So if we look at 1914, this is from Blackiston Shoulder, how it's changed to 2004 when we went back for the first time to do repeat images. And then in 2019, which is, for those of you who know southwestern Alberta, you'll remember the Kenow wildfire from 2017, which transformed the landscape significantly. But what's kind of cool is that Claire is able to use machine learning to automatically classify the landscape. So these are new techniques we're still working with, trying to look at different vegetation cover types. That's 2014, here's 2004. And then of course, the arrival of red. This is the Kenow wildfire. So that's cool in itself. But what Claire's been working on and others have been working on is how do you actually get a spatially explicit view of those changes on the landscape? And so she's developing tools in the platform called QGIS, series of plugins that will allow for georeferenced images so you can actually drape those land classifications over the landscape. This has huge potential, for example, in the work that Bill is doing with fire, and to be able to look at how things have changed at a very fine scale and very accurately. So an example, again, same image I showed before, but now we're laying those classifications down as though they were, well, as accurate representations. This is from 1914, and we look at the changes to 2004, and then again, the Kenow wildfire. So anyway, these I wanted to focus on Claire's work a little bit because she's developing tools that will be available and disseminated widely so that we can actually look at these images in new and exciting ways. And then very similar is work done by James Tricker, another PhD candidate in Jasper National Park, where he's taken techniques similar to what Claire used, but has created fully composite maps. So this represents, I think, 29 different images put together. And on the left side is a map of vegetation from Jasper in 1915. And then you see beside it is 2019 and 2020. So anyway, we're working with these techniques significantly to try to understand the dynamics of change in different ways. Now I'm rushing, sorry. But we're also working as a larger group to try to look at how novelty is emerging in the landscape with all those drivers of change I talked about. And so I'm not going to go into, we're lacking time, so I'm not going to go into detail, but this is being led, a project that's being led by Janine Remtula's group at UBC and my group here at the University of Victoria. And it's Alina Fisher is the lead author on this manuscript. So looking at new ways in which novelty is emerging at a landscape scale. All right, to wrap up, how can the Mountain Legacy Project support Indigenous reconciliation and resurgence? A huge question, one that we're exploring. We're excited about it. It's new for all of us, and we're learning, always learning. So the summary is that images are powerful testimonies of changes in landscapes and cultural lifeways. So images are powerful. And archives are a rich, if painstakingly demanding, source of historical knowledge. And finally, colonial archives can be repurposed in support of Indigenous reconciliation and resurgence. And stay tuned for the next few years as we move forward with the project with Stoney Nakoda Nation, and we'll see where that goes. So thank you so much for your time today and your interest in the project. We have lots of people supported our work, including the Canadian Mountain Network, and we're very grateful to all of that support. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric and Sarah and Bill. That was amazing. I thought I knew a lot about the MLP, and now I realize that you've been holding out on me. So I might be one of those people digging in to the wee hours of the night looking at images. We've had some really great comments come up in the chat. And before we start on the questions, I just wanted to acknowledge that a few people have noted how interesting this was, and I just wanted to give a big proud shout out and of thanks to Minister Daniel Kwan Watson for his comment and praise of excellent presentations. Very much enjoyed them, and we appreciate that Minister Watson had took the time to join us here today as well. So, so very, very grateful for that. So yeah, I guess, I just have this burning, question you left us a little bit dangling there. You've got some plans for the future. And so I guess if you want to maybe take a few moments and tell us what vision, what does come next from here?
Well, you've heard from Bill and Sarah. Do you want to look at where you aspirationally think this might go, and I can speak to some other things too.
Well, I mean, I suppose one thing that, as I mentioned, just really intrigues me is thinking of, the current way that the images are shared. It's unbelievable in terms of the depth of the collection, the breadth of it, and that it is under this Creative Commons, open access license, so that others are able to get to it. But I think for some less academic audiences, it's not as exciting maybe as the story could be. And so I'm intrigued by thinking of some other ways to share those images and spark more discussion and excitement about what can be learned from them and how they can be put, how they can be utilized by a number of different groups and communities to kind of advance several different types of knowledge, right? So I think just opening up the possibilities for how this can be used is what excites me most, is next steps, I think.
Bill?
Yeah, I think it's really important. The images certainly speak to changes in the vegetation, but maybe one of the things that I've always been interested in is one of the projects that we've been involved with is the bison reintroduction project in Banff National Park. And I believe that, there are landscapes out there that looked a certain way 100 years ago because we had different kinds of wildlife on those landscapes. And returning especially keystone and culturally important species like bison to landscapes, mountain landscapes, that I think really speaks to the indigenous resilience, indigenous resurgence areas that we raised at the beginning. Not just bison, but other wildlife that really need to be on these landscapes because they were really critical in maintaining these open areas. And we're seeing the impacts of not having indigenous input and not having wildlife on these landscapes. All kinds of pressures now on mountain landscapes: fire, water, invasive species, pressures from tourism and other avenues. So really important to do this kind of research, adding to what we already know, adding that indigenous knowledge system to our current knowledge system. So hopefully we'll make better decisions going forward and not just rely on one system or one way of thinking. So really important, I think, work that Mount Legacy Project is doing with communities like Stoney, but more importantly, I guess, the results of those kind of works. Are we doing just great research, or are we going to act on it? So pressures on mountain landscapes are real. So hopefully we'll see some good outcomes that come from all of this research.
Yeah, I didn't mention in my haste to Claire Wright is working down in Waterton and is in partnership with the Kainai First Nation as well, looking at partnerships there. Nicole, if I just take a moment and answer the questions that you were asking speculatively, I think there's two things that fascinate me. One is how we unlock these images in new ways, so how we can represent them and help people see them, whether it's blowing the images up for very large size, like in the wall behind me, and people see things differently, or putting them on large screens and having touch screen monitors and being able to manipulate images. It doesn't matter. There's fascinating to be able to unlock it and using some of the analytic tools that we've got. But the other thing that's, and I say this all apart from what we've talked about in terms of Indigenous resurgence and the research projects underway, but I stay awake at nights worrying about digital permanence, which is a pretty obscure concept, but it refers to how it is that we're going to keep digital assets going in the future. And so we've been working with the National Archives over 20 years now, and we still haven't cracked that yet. So occasionally I worry about, how do we take this massive set of digital images that are so valuable because people can look at them. People can't look at glass plates. They're in sleeves and climate-controlled vaults 3 stories underground in Gatineau, Quebec. Nobody can look at them unless they're digitized. But how do we work out ways of mobilizing this into the future so that in 20 and 40 and 100 years, people are still able to see them? So that's something that I'm working on now, a number of different initiatives to try to support, image permanence.
Okay. We actually have a question from the audience here. So if you could help with, what does this research tell us about what we should consider a baseline condition for the landscape or natural range of variability is? So thinking in the context of water landscape management.
Wow. Do you want me to take that?
I feel like, yeah,
No
that's
pressure.
an Eric
Yeah,
question.
no, it's an Eric question. Well, I'd almost say it's a James Tricker question. This is exactly what his PhD is looking at in Jasper, is trying to understand this notion of historic range of variability and baseline that goes along with that. And I think, this is kind of a quaint story now, but when I was at the University of Alberta as a young faculty member, I did my first ever poster presentation. It was a very big deal for me. And I went and I put, got poster board, and I had a printed version of the historic image and a printed version of our repeat image. And I had them like stuck on with Velcro to the poster board. And it's pretty rudimentary by today's standards, I know. And anyway, I've been doing this poster, didn't have a lot of traffic. It was a huge research fair and I didn't have a lot of traffic. So I decided finally to go and grab a bite to eat. And I asked my, turned out very mischievous mechanical engineering colleague who had the booth across from me to look after, just kind of keep an eye on things while I went for lunch. And I came back and there was this throng of people around my booth. And there was the mechanical engineer who had changed the story completely. He had taken the photographs off the Velcro, switched them so that the really nice looking forested landscape of contemporary times, it was all trees, was the historic one. And the really bad, nasty image is what you would expect was the sparse one that was, in the so-called modern position. So he flipped them. And he was telling this great elaborate story about how, everything was going to hell in a handcart. And, and it was such a great moment for me because I realized that, well, he was being very mischievous, but it was also that people's perception of what they want to see by way of baseline is really important in shaping what we do, how we act on the landscape. And so, if your view is that the proper baseline of a landscape is a fixed composition or pattern on the landscape, it's probably going to get you into trouble because these landscapes are changing a lot. So arguably, and I'm pretty, the landscape in Jasper National Park in 1915 was probably a little closer to what a long-term set of dynamic changes were because there was more regular fire and pattern, Indigenous engagement, and so on. And that's what we see in Kananaskis country, where Bill is in that area.
Yeah,
So-
but just add to that, sorry, Eric,
Oh, go ahead.
that hopefully part of the baseline will be understanding the cultural context, especially for a lot of these source water places. So Moraine Lake, the example that we started off with, the peaks, the lakes, those are the water towers of much of our society, not just for us, but for all the vegetation and all the wildlife as well. So hopefully taking into context those cultural considerations. We didn't get a chance to show it, but we've done one of the poster images on Lake Louise as well, with a whole backstory that goes with that. So understanding going forward, but understanding also looking back as well. Thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Keep going. You. We have a couple other comments that have come through, and I want to try to touch on them if we can. I just want to know if anyone has tried satellite imagery with ground repeat historical imagery to answer questions about change, vegetation, wildlife corridors.
Short answer is no. As far as it has been done in other parts of the world, but it's sort of emerging now with some of the new techniques, some of the new methods that we have available to us. So what I find fascinating about the work that Claire and James are doing in terms of this work with point clouds, basically LiDAR data, digital elevation modeling, is that we're able to interpose images. So we can take, and I think Kelsey in her comments here is mentioning the air photo database at the University of Calgary. And we can interpose oblique images that come from mountaintops and aerial images and satellite imagery, and bring those into relationship with one another in new ways that we haven't been able to before. So the historic images open up just another portal looking at the landscape that we haven't had available to us before. And I think they can play nice with some of the remotely sensed data, but we're just kind of in the early stages of that. We're part of a consortium looking at mountain pine beetle issues that Foothills Research Institute has been sponsoring, and colleagues from the University of Lethbridge, Laura Chasmer, and sorry, I'm having a gap. Chris Hopkinson, sorry, have been doing are doing work with LiDAR data and remotely sensed data that we're really interested in, joining them and trying to understand that better.
Okay.
Thanks for the question.
Want to go back and we've got a lot of questions on the how to on the science end of things here, but Bill touched on that we're bringing different knowledge systems together as you start working together, and you've got a really great relationship between you as you've embarked on this journey. Maybe Bill, can you help us understand, as people want to, as they bring these knowledge systems together, and what would this look like for other people who want to start working in this way and with images in this way, to be able to make sure that decolonization takes place.
Thanks. So as Sarah mentioned in the beginning, there's a number of more Indigenous processes and methodologies that have been written about in the more recent history. So there's a lot of more work that's been coming out, and I guess that's why we took the opportunity that we did to encapsulate that into the Bison report, recognizing that incorporating traditional knowledge into Western systems, that's a question that's been that I've been hearing going back to 2010. And we still don't have answers to how that can be done. We talk about a process in the Bison report, talking more about themes and how that can be incorporated. It's being done to various levels. and in different ways for different projects. And really, we don't. It's sort of an open-ended type of answer. But I think what is important is to really involve a process that's going to be meaningful to Indigenous groups in and around where these certain projects are being proposed. We won't have one answer to fit all scenarios. You know, it's not a scientific equation that's going to fit everyone. So I just would really encourage people to read some of the material that we've talked about. Bison studies on the Canadian Mountain Network, and we touch on very briefly on some of those other methodologies. But I think it's going to come over a period of time, and just really thankful to the Canadian Mountain Network for funding so many Indigenous knowledge studies over the years, because that's what's missing in our knowledge of landscapes, vegetation, wildlife. It's a big area that's missing that we need more information on. So for Stoney, you know, we're involved in other wildlife studies out in the Kananaskis region. So we hope to build on what we've already accomplished through the bison study. But as I say, it's going to be different for just as you have those other methodologies by Elder Albert Marshall out at Mi'kmaq out on the East Coast, Potawatomi biologist Robin Wall Kimmerer and her process on braiding sweetgrass. These are all methodologies developed by nations or representatives of, but we certainly haven't heard from everyone. So we don't have the whole plethora of methodologies that could be drawn from. So again, the answer hopefully is out there, is some combination of what we're doing and maybe other nations are doing. But really just having this opportunity to have an impact on decisions and decision making, I think that's a really important part of the process as well.
Well
Thank
put.
you, Bill. Yeah.
Nicole, may I mention one thing that I probably should mention in the presentation, but so right now we're struggling, we're working on it from a sort of digital presentation point of view, is how to let people know that we actually have tens of thousands of images that are across the Mountain West, and we haven't actually looked at them yet, and yet they exist. So what we're going to do over the next year, thanks to CMN support, is trying to find out ways of being able to present that sort of in the form of, you know, well, we don't exactly know where these images are, but there's 292 of them in this that correspond to this particular topographic map sheet, so that at least people know that there are images there that we can look at. And then we would invite people, if you have interest. So you can basically assume that if you're in a mountainous part of Western Canada, which is quite a lot of Western Canada, there are going to be historic survey images. And while we haven't looked at, we've only looked at about 15% of the collection, we're happy to help and go into more detail. Yeah, it's just fast, and it's really, really time-consuming to work with, but we invite partnerships, because the kind of partnership that we're doing with Stoney Nakoda Nation is allowing us to digitize some images and get those up and out and do some more repeat photography. And anyway, we're very open to that. I just wanted to mention that if you don't see it immediately on Mountain Legacy Explorer, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, your image collection is huge, and we have a lot of work to do to help support you in getting the word out so that it can really be put to its fullest potential. So I'm just gonna wrap this up. I really appreciated hearing today about the depth of what the MLP and all of your members are working on, and the work towards to decolonizing these collections, and the need to bring in different knowledge systems and learn to work together in a good way, and the work that will help support the conservation and the future of these landscapes. So thank you all for sharing your time with us today. We'll export this recording and we'll make sure that it's shared with everybody as well who couldn't attend. And we'll send out some links to those key reports that people have mentioned and stuff as well, so that everybody can learn more from here. So thank you very much for your time today.
Thank
Have a
you.
great evening.
Yes, thank you.
Bye-bye.